tell us about the 5 common arguments that atheists use.
The 5 would be, can God make a rock so big that he can't lift it? Who created God? If you were raised in another country, say in the Middle East somewhere, you might likely be a Muslim. Does that undermine your own confidence in your Christianity or belief in God? Christians are already atheists with respect to the vast majority of God. So we're just believing in one less God than you do. And then last, we just believe in God to plug a hole in our scientific knowledge. These arguments all actually do have logical flaws, and so it's important for us to understand those and grow in our faith.
What do I do if I hear an objection to Christianity that I don't know how to answer?
Right.
There are many arguments that atheists use to challenge Christianity, and it can be tough sometimes for Christians to know how to answer these. Today, Keaton, you're going to help us as we're going to address 5 common arguments that atheists used. And with your master's degree in apologetics, you're well versed in these arguments. So tell us about the 5 that we'll be covering today.
Okay. Yeah, these are 5 that I hear time and time again. I would say they may not be atheists' favorite arguments. They might not be the most powerful, but I also haven't cherry-picked arguments to easily knock down a weak opponent. Rather, I want Christians to see that there are fatal flaws in these arguments, and so not to be intimidated by them. They may not be easy to see the flaws in, and that's why we're going to dissect them together and help Christians to be prepared with answers. And so the 5 in order would be, number 1, who created God? Does he need a cause? The second would be this common challenge that says, well, you Christians are already atheists with respect to the vast majority of gods, like Vishnu and Horus and so forth. And so we're just believing in one less God than you do. Then we'll look at a challenge to God's omnipotence, that is, meaning he's all-powerful. And this is the classic question, can God make a rock so big that he can't lift it? Then we'll move on to an objection dealing with cultural influences. It is, if you were raised in another country, like say in the Middle East somewhere, you might likely be a Muslim. Does that undermine your own confidence in your Christianity or belief in God? And then last, we'll deal with an objection from science. Atheists often see this as a strong weapon in their arsenal, and they say that science has increasingly found explanations for things formerly attributed to God. And so do we just believe in God to plug a hole, maybe a gap in our scientific knowledge? And the more science discovers, the less and less there is for God to do. So we can take those in order. And again, I would say these arguments all actually do have fundamental logical flaws. And so it's important for us to understand those to give Christians confidence that they don't need to be intimidated by these challenges. But also, I would say that atheists can learn from this and really stop using these bad arguments and either find better ones or maybe give up your atheism. That's my hope.
Okay, well, tell us a little bit about your faith. Have you always believed in God?
At least as long as I can remember. It's interesting. There are scientific studies of children raised in atheist homes that show even many of these children not taught about God, they naturally form a belief in God anyway. And this is consistent with what we read in the Bible in Romans 1 that says God's existence is actually obvious from the things that he's made. We look at creation and we see that there must be a creator. And so I think that idea influenced me as a young boy, but I was also raised in a Christian home. So my parents taught me about God, and I even believed in the gospel message from the time I was 7 years old. My mom led me to the Lord, so I don't ever remember a time of not being a Christian. But at the same time, I don't believe in Christianity blindly or merely because of my upbringing. I could see even as a boy that there are good reasons to believe in God. And I was sort of a critical thinker who always asked that question, how do I know this is really true? And so then the older I got, I understood the evidence and the arguments in a more in-depth way. And I tell you what, the more I study, the more convinced I am that God is real. And I do think Romans 1 is right, that nobody has an excuse not to believe because the evidence is abundant and clear. It's really obvious that God exists, and those who don't believe in him, I think, are suppressing the truth in unrighteousness, as Romans also talks about.
Well, I think that's a major tripping point for many atheists, evidence for God. So before we get into those 5, can you share a little bit about some of the evidence that is for the case of God?
Yeah, and there are so many things. It astonishes me that some people will say there's just no evidence that God is real. And to me, that's sad because it just shows that they're unaware of the many powerful arguments that intelligent people, scholars and philosophers and theologians have been talking about for not just centuries, but millennia, frankly. And so we have this rich tradition in the church of powerful evidence that God exists, different arguments like, there are classic philosophical arguments, like the most obvious is the argument from design, that we see certain hallmarks of the handiwork of a designer in, for example, living things, life itself. How could life have come about without a designer? Living things exhibit this sophisticated complexity that requires foresight. Natural processes alone are incapable of producing things like the information that we find in DNA. If you find information, it must have had an author. And in our repeated experience, you can always trace information back to an intelligent source, not unguided, blind forces of nature like natural selection and mutations. So even though atheists often, think they can account for the apparent design in living things, those explanations really are scientifically inadequate. But also, it is fascinating that they admit up front that the world appears designed. They don't deny that the world looks to be designed, that the sort of initial explanation that, as I mentioned earlier, even children conclude that God is real from looking at the things that have been made. So that's the design argument. And that's really a whole family of arguments that includes not just living things, but the universe itself. Many scientists today talk about how it is fine-tuned to allow life to exist in the first place. And this has to do with, certain fundamental aspects of the laws of physics, like the strength of the force of gravity and the electromagnetic force and so forth. These, it turns out, have precise values that have to be either what they are or something within a very narrow range of the wide variety of possibilities of what these values could have been. And had they been different, then life would not be possible. Stars could not form, chemistry would not occur, and so forth. And so the universe is fine-tuned, which points to a fine-tuner. But even beyond these scientific arguments, you've got all kinds of things like we all recognize right and wrong. And there seems to be a moral law that's above human beings that points to a moral lawgiver. And lots of other arguments. The beginning of the universe, it seems, has not existed from eternity past. What science tells us is the universe is running down, almost like a top spinning. Eventually, it'll run out of gas, right? And that also suggests it can't have been spinning from all eternity. Otherwise, it already would have run out of that usable energy. So this is, the second law of thermodynamics tells us that the universe is winding down, therefore it must have had a beginning. And what brought it into being? If it had a beginning, it requires a cause. And that's just a handful. Really, we could talk about so many more things, consciousness and things that are hard for atheists to explain, but they point to the reality of a creator.
Before we continue, a quick heads up. Stick around until the end of the interview because for a limited time, we're going to offer a free stream of Dr. Sarfati's video, Refuting the New Atheist. This tackles the top objections atheists have with the truthfulness of the Bible. You don't want to miss this offer. All right, so I think that's helpful information to have as foundational as we jump into these 5 arguments. So thank you for that. So let's go ahead and get into the first one. And I think it had to do with who created God.
Okay, yes. Now, this is a question that sometimes children innocently ask just because they're curious, and it's a good question to address. But it is surprising to me how some even prominent atheists like Richard Dawkins, maybe the world's most famous atheist today, years ago when I read his book, The Blind Watchmaker, which that title refers to evolution. He thinks that you don't need a watchmaker to make watches, comparing this to living things. Living things are like the watch. He says, no, that appearance of design can be explained away by evolution. But before I read the book, I assumed he would marshal all these scientific arguments to make the case that evolution is fact. Instead, his book was largely one sustained argument that was more philosophical in nature, and it has to do with this question of, well, where did God come from? If God is the creator of the universe and of living things, then somebody must have made him as well. But the simple answer, in one sense, or the first thing that I want to point out in response to this question is there is a built-in assumption to the question. It's called a complex question. The assumption is that God did have a creator. So if somebody puts it just like that, who created God? I will say, well, why are you assuming that someone created God? Because the Christian doesn't believe this, right? We believe what the Bible teaches, that God is eternal. He's always been here. So nobody made him. He didn't come from anywhere. He has always existed. And notice the atheist doesn't believe that God had a creator either, because he doesn't even believe God is real. So why does the question assume God had a creator when nobody in the discussion believes that he did? But of course, what's implied, that what they're really getting at, maybe a more sophisticated questioner might ask, if the universe requires a creator, then why doesn't God? Are we just sort of being arbitrary in saying that the universe must have a cause, but God doesn't require a cause or a creator? And I would say what I've already said in my positive case for God helps to answer that challenge, because we're not claiming that everything that exists must have had a cause. Rather, things that begin to exist, those certainly require a cause. And it is clear that the universe began to exist. Even many atheists recognize this today because of things like the law of entropy, which is what I already talked about as the second law of thermodynamics. The universe is winding down, therefore it can't have existed from all eternity. So it's clear the universe must have had a cause to bring it into being. Things just don't pop into being inexplicably without a cause, right? But by contrast, Christians have always taught, the Bible has always claimed that God is eternal. And so given that, it's not obvious that he requires a cause. So there is an asymmetry between God and the universe in that respect. And one other thing to point out is I think this is intellectually satisfying, because I'm not saying that God, therefore, is just a brute fact, that he has no explanation for why he exists. There was a brilliant mathematician and philosopher from a few centuries ago named Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who was trying to wrestle with the question of why does anything exist at all? And he recognized that when we consider the things that do exist, you can distinguish between things that exist because of some external cause, and he called those things contingent, which means that their existence is not necessary. They could have not existed, right? That's a possibility. And the vast majority of things that we are familiar with are contingent things, like people and planets and mountains and computers and so forth. They might not have existed. But Leibniz says this can't be the ultimate explanation for reality. You need to ground these contingent things in something that is necessary, that just exists because of a necessity of its own nature. But it's hard to think of sort of examples of what that might be. I would say the laws of logic might be a good example of something that exists necessarily. It can't fail to exist. And Leibniz said, God also must exist in this way necessarily. And that makes sense then as a reason why he exists and is the ground for all other realities that he was free to create. And so God is necessary, but he made contingent things possible.
Right, so that one begins with a faulty assumption, right?
Yeah.
Well, what about the second one that has to do with Christians are really atheists?
Sure. And sometimes it's put like this, that we are atheists with respect to all the other gods besides the one that we believe in, Horus and Vishnu and so forth. And therefore the atheists say, we just believe in one less God than you do. Now, if it's only an assertion without drawing out any implications of that statement, I suppose I can agree with the statement. It's true that I believe in one more God than the atheists. But I think what they're really getting at is to say that, therefore, there's no profound difference between us, and you may as well give up in your belief in God altogether then. But that just doesn't follow from the starting point. I would also quibble with the use of language there to say I'm an atheist with respect to. The term atheist really just is a denial that any gods exist. So I don't think it's proper to call me an atheist with respect to a particular god. And so a good analogy for this might be, consider the difference between a married man and a bachelor. The difference between them is just one wife, right? But would we say that a married man is actually a bachelor with respect to the vast majority of women that have ever existed? No, that's kind of an abuse of the term bachelor, right? But more importantly, it shows that there is a profound difference between having no wife at all and one wife. And it doesn't follow from the difference between just one that the married man should treat his wife as if she doesn't exist or just get rid of her, right? No. In the same way, there is a profound difference between atheists and Christians and the implications of whether the God we believe in, who is not one of these finite gods like Vishnu and Zeus, but he is the transcendent, almighty, all-knowing creator of all things and the ground for moral goodness. And so, more sophisticated, more informed atheists do recognize that it does make a huge difference, practically speaking, in our lives, whether God is real. You think of somebody like Friedrich Nietzsche and his famous parable of the madman, where he uses this to say that society has killed God in the sense that we've kind of abandoned belief in him, but the people in the parable don't believe in God, and yet they haven't yet realized the profound ramifications this has for society. You can't have the fruit of Christianity if you undermine the roots. And so this is what Nietzsche was getting at, that actually it's pretty significant if we abandon belief in God. And he talked about how this means we're sort of unchained from the sun. Is there any up or down any longer? Right and wrong becomes relative and so on. And so, I'm not going to abandon my belief in God just because the atheists point out I don't believe in other gods.
All right, let's move on to one that's seemingly a little more simplistic. The third one has to do with what God can and can't do.
Right. And yes, this is the challenge to God's omnipotence, which again, that term just means that God is all-powerful. And this is how the Bible describes God. So the challenge goes like this: can God make a rock so big that he can't lift it? Now, this is set up as a dilemma, right? You've got two options. You can say, on the one hand, maybe God can't make that rock, or maybe he can, but then if he could, he wouldn't be able to lift it. And I do think it's a true dilemma. We have to choose one of those two options. But the atheist sees this as a way of undermining the idea of God's omnipotence. But I don't think that's the case. I believe the true answer is that no, God could not make a rock so big that he can't lift it. But sometimes when we're speaking in simple language, we might say that God being omnipotent means that he can do anything, or he can do all things. And what we typically mean by that is not strictly literally speaking true. Rather, God's omnipotence means that God can do anything power can do. But I can think of plenty of things that God is not capable of doing. For example, we already talked about how God exists necessarily. That means God cannot fail to exist. He can't cease to exist. He can't stop being God. He can't commit evil acts, right? God is perfectly good. But this is not somehow undermining God's authority or his power. These are not weaknesses in God. Rather, it's a strength that God can't fail to exist and that he can't do something morally evil. And so a proper understanding of God's being all-powerful means that he can do anything power can do. Power is not capable of doing logical contradictions, for example. And so, God can't make a square circle, which is just a meaningless combination of words. It's impossible that a square circle exists, or a married bachelor, for example. And so that's no threat to Christianity to say that God can't do something. It's not a weakness in God. It's actually a strength.
Okay, that's very helpful to help us to think about that in regard to God's character. So how about the fourth one that has to do with the influence of culture?
Right. Now, I've had atheists put this question to me personally in private conversations. They say, well, you are perhaps only a Christian because you were raised in a Christian culture. in the Western world where Christianity is very prevalent. But had you been born in, say, Saudi Arabia or another Muslim country, isn't it likely that you would be a Muslim? Well, there are a couple of responses I want to give to that challenge. The main problem with it is really, it's not dealing with the evidence for and against Christianity. It's actually changing the subject to something that is irrelevant to the heart of the issue. But before I get to that aspect, let me actually say first, I'm not sure I even buy into the premise of the challenge because it treats it as though I've concluded that Christianity is true merely because of an accident of history, and I'm sort of helpless and powerless against the culture that has influenced me to think the way that I do. That's not necessarily the case. The Bible even gives me reason to challenge that assumption. For example, in Acts 17, the Apostle Paul, when he's speaking to some of the Greek philosophers in Athens, he says to them that God has determined the different places and times in which people live, which nation that he places them in order that people would reach out, seek God, and find him, even though he's not that far from each one of us. And so God is sovereign over history, and he actually has a say in when I existed and who my parents were and things like this. And so I would say for myself personally, I haven't merely allowed culture to influence me. I've tried to critically analyze the truth claims of Christianity, and I think I do have strong intellectual reasons for believing them. But let me even concede the point and say, okay, maybe if I had been raised in a Muslim country, I might have turned out to be a Muslim. That's still irrelevant to whether or not Christianity is true. It's not dealing with the evidence itself. It's asking a question about me personally and my psychology and the cultural influences that have shaped me and this hypothetical alternative history scenario, which is not reality. And so, even if I have poor reasons for believing in Christianity, there still could be good reasons apart from my own beliefs. And so the challenger really needs to deal with the evidence itself rather than asking questions about why I've come to believe in Christianity. In fact, this is actually, if you consult textbooks on logic, this is a clear case example of a logical fallacy. It's called the genetic fallacy. And that doesn't have anything to do with DNA. Genetic, just in this sense, means trying to discredit an idea by tracing it to its source or the origin of that belief. So like another good example of this would be, there was a famous chemist named Kekulé who was trying to determine the molecular structure of benzene. And the way he figured it out is because he was dreaming one night and had a dream about a snake grasping its own tail. And it occurred to him, oh, maybe benzene is a ring structure. But can anybody say, well, that shows benzene maybe really isn't a ring structure just because this idea originated in the man's dream? No, not at all. Benzene is a ring regardless of how Kekulé came to that conclusion. And in the same way, Christianity is true because reality backs it up, because the evidence points in that direction, regardless of how I personally came to believe in the Christian faith.
I hope you're enjoying this interview so far. Creating content like this takes a considerable amount of time, effort, and resources. We're passionate about getting this message out, and we want to keep bringing you more videos like this one. But here's the thing, we need your help to make that happen. Your support, no matter how big or small, will help us cover our production costs and enable us to continue creating impactful content. To support this project, just use the link in the description below or the on-screen prompt. We're so thankful for your support. All right, so let's segue as we move to our fifth argument to more of a science area where people say that God is simply a plug in science for what we don't know.
Yeah. Atheists often appeal to science. I think they tend to see themselves as rationalists and as though science backs up their claims. But in this case, what they're really saying is that the Christian belief in God is merely an appeal to ignorance rather than the best conclusion from the evidence that we have. But I would say this is not the way that Christians tend to argue that God is real. We actually do have powerful, strong reasons from science that help to show that. And so a good analogy in this case is, imagine you find a dead body and there are 5 bullet holes in the person's back, and we want to figure out what is it that caused this person's death. Was it just him dying of natural causes? Was it accidental? Or was there design involved? Was it an agent, an intelligent person with a motive who murdered this person? Well, it's kind of obvious just from the facts that I've given you, right? Like, nobody would say that we believe in a murderer of the gaps just because we, assume from the evidence that we have that a murderer was responsible, that it must have been design. Maybe science just hasn't yet discovered the naturalistic explanation for this man's death. We know from our experience that natural processes are not capable of producing effects like bullet holes. And so it's the same with the things that God made in the world. Living things, as I mentioned before, exhibit this sophisticated complexity that requires foresight. Not only are natural processes inadequate to account for these specific details of living things, but also in our experience, designers can produce those sorts of effects. And so we have a positive reason to believe that God is the one responsible. It's not just, we don't know what the cause is yet, therefore let's assume God did it. And notice, by the way, even this admission that there are gaps in our scientific knowledge, then the atheists are really the ones who are guilty here of plugging in the gap with an appeal to blind faith, assuming that they'll one day discover a naturalistic cause will be the answer. And so the shoe here, I would say, is on the other foot. We are not guilty of this God of the gaps fallacy. It's the atheists who have a blind faith that natural processes alone are adequate to explain all of reality, when actually the details of that reality point to God.
You've given us a lot to think about. Mm-hmm. It's been very helpful, but we said even from the beginning we were only going to cover 5 arguments. So can you help us with some principles that we could apply to perhaps other arguments when we hear them that we've perhaps never heard before or don't really know how to answer them? So help us segue to other topics.
Sure. Well, one thing is, I think once we become familiar with arguments like the ones I shared or defenses against the criticisms that I shared, this can strengthen our faith and give us confidence when we encounter new challenges in the future, because I think it's helpful just to keep these in perspective. Say we encounter some argument that we don't know how to answer. We don't need to waver in our faith, be tossed to and fro by the waves of the sea, as the scripture talks about, the way they children. We should mature and grow in our faith into adulthood. And the way we do that is in part by studying the Bible, reading it, other spiritual disciplines like prayer and doing good works and loving the truth. But then also, the more equipped we are in having those answers and having studied apologetics, for example, the more we'll see that we can put this challenge in perspective and not let it take an outsized role and think that how we answer this one question means the truth or falsity of Christianity. We can say, I have lots of good reasons to believe. I don't know how to answer this one challenge, but all this evidence over here clearly shows that Christianity is true. I would say it's also good when you're dialoguing with a non-believer to admit when you don't know something. Certainly, we don't want to bluff our way through and then, misrepresent Christianity or, be poor ambassadors for Christ. One good thing to do as well is to say, well, let me look into that and I'll get back to you if I, can find an answer. And that really shows respect to your opponent as well. Another thing I would say is that we should not just, use our critical thinking skills to scrutinize Christianity and all of its difficulties, because every worldview has difficulties. And one thing that I find so tragic is in many young people, when I see them being raised in the church and then walking away from the faith, oftentimes it's because they're hyper-focused on problems they see for the Bible or God or something about the Christian faith. They tend not to apply that same critical thinking to whatever worldview they move to. And yet you can't just be neutral. The moment you abandon Christianity, you have to believe in something else. And so we need to have equal weights and measures here and look at the flaws in other worldviews. And I would say that Christianity is the most credible intellectually. It's why I believe in Christianity, that it does match with reality. And it's a lot like one of the instances in the Gospels where, Jesus talked about that people to follow him would have to drink his blood and eat his flesh. And people didn't understand what he meant at the time. It was a hard saying. And unfortunately, many disciples left him at that time. And so Jesus asked the 12, "Are you going to leave me too?" And one of them, I think it might have been Peter, said, "Lord, to whom else would we go? You have the words of eternal life." And that's the way I think about worldviews in general, that what other worldview could I go to if I abandoned Christianity? None of the rest of them make sense of reality in the way that Christianity does. And so to whom else would we go? Jesus has the words of eternal life.
Well, I think these have been very helpful principles, so thank you for that. But if someone wants to go a little bit further, wants to know more, we do have a free streaming video. I believe you have it with you here, Refuting the New Atheists. Can you tell us about it?
Well, this is an excellent lecture by one of our staff scientists, Dr. Jonathan Sarfati, who's a really brilliant, careful thinker, precise logic. And so what he does is just unpacks a number of these arguments that are made by the so-called new atheists, but these are really old arguments, and he takes them apart, point by point. And so this would be a great place to learn more if people want to follow up and to get some answers to further arguments that atheists make.
And if you want to take advantage of the free streaming video, the link is in the description. Thanks so much for your insight today, Keaton.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.